Hi, in this tutorial I will show how you can plot data from a database using ScottPlot. ScottPlot is a free and open source plotting library for .NET. In this tutorial I will use the SQL Server from Microsoft. So now we have learned how to plot historical data using this ScottPlot library. We also learned how to plot real-time data. The next step would be to show how we can plot data that are stored in a database. So we will use the SQL Server in combination with this ScottPlot library. So here you see the example application that we are going to create. So here we have this ScottPlot with title, X label, Y label and the data inside, and in this case the data we see here are stored in a database, in an SQL Server database. In addition, we just add a data grid view as well in the bottom here to show the data that are present in this plot. So basically we are going to create a very simple database and a very simple database table. Normally you typically have a more complex database structure, but this is just to demonstrate the principle. So I have created just a table called data. We can assume the data that should be stored in this table are coming from a temperature sensor. And then I create just three simple columns. One data ID, which is basically a primary key. In this case, I have created it to be an identity 11, meaning this value is created automatically by the database. So when you put data into this table, it will start by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And then I have a timestamp and then the actual data value. For the timestamp, I just use default and the built-in getDate function in order to automatically insert the current date time for each record in the database. So now I have opened my SQL Server Management Studio, which is the tool that you are using in order to interact with your SQL Server database. So basically, here is the table script that I showed you. And basically, in order to insert that specific table into the database, you just click execute and then this table will be created. I have already done that, and you see it here, the data table, which has been created. I have also inserted some data. In order to insert data, of course you should log data from a real sensor, but in order to create this charting example, you can also right click here, edit top 200 row, and then just enter data here manually. Then I can select all from data, and then you see that these data has been created inside the table. So now we know that we have some data. So the next step now is to create a Visual Studio application that are actually plotting these values. So now we are back in Visual Studio, and now I have actually created a new WinForms application, which is empty. So the next step now is to install the necessary NuGet packages. So let's start with the NuGet package for the plotting, the ScottPlot library. So then just search for ScottPlot, and then we use this ScottPlot.WinForms, install it. Okay, so now we have installed the ScottPlot library. The next is to install the NuGet package for communicating with an SQL Server database. So the namespace for this one is called Microsoft.data.SQL client. So that's the NuGet package that you need to use in order to communicate with an SQL Server database from Microsoft. So then just select this NuGet package and click install. Click OK. And now actually we have installed two NuGet packages. If we go back to the Solution Explorer here in Visual Studio and dependencies and packages, you have the ScottPlot NuGet package, and you have the Microsoft.data Add.SQL client. So then we have all the packages we need in order to create an application that retrieve data from a database and plot it using this ScottPlot library. Then I just drag in the necessary components here from the toolbox. Start with the ScottPlot, and then also I'm using this data grid view. Just search for it, data grid view. Select this one, drag it down here. Just make it in the same size as the chart, like this. So basically this is the graphical user interface we have. We have a chart and we have a data grid view. So the next step would be to create a separate class for the data communication part. So then I just here in my project just create a new folder. So add new folder, and I create a folder for that I just call classes. So here inside this folder you can create the classes that you need in your application. Then I right click on the folder and then just create or add a class. And then since we are going to simulate that we are logging data from a temperature sensor, I just call this class sensor data.cs like this. So in order to save some time, I just copy and paste some code that I have already made. So basically now we are in the sensor data class, and then I here create 3 properties: data ID, data timestamp, and data value, which is the same names. Of course you can call it whatever you like, but that's the same names that we are using in our database. Basically the data ID column, the data timestamp, and the data value. So basically we are going to retrieve the data from the database into these 3 properties, and then we create a method called, we can call it whatever we like, but I call it get sensor data, and the return value of this method is a list of these 3 data. So the first thing we need to do is to create a connection string, which is basically the name of our data source, which is the name of our SQL server, which you find here in the top here. So that's the name of your SQL server. And then here you have the name of your database. In my case it's called sensor system. So it's here. So that's the connection string you need in order to log on to your database from the C# code. Then we just specify the data that we want to retrieve. Basically a simple select statement: select data ID, comma, data timestamp, comma, data value from data table. So basically this query makes sure that we retrieve all data from our table. Next, we inside this while loop, we make sure that we retrieve the proper data from these 3 columns in the table into these properties, namely data ID, data timestamp, and data value. So that's happening here in these 3 lines. So we retrieve the data ID from the database, we retrieve the data timestamp, and then finally the data value. And then we just return the entire list of data that are retrieved from the database. So basically that's the sensor data.cs class. I just remove those, you don't need those. So that basically you need also to include this using Microsoft.data.sql client in order to use the methods for communicating and retrieving data from the database. So then we are back in our form 1 and in the designer. I just double click here in order to create the code for retrieving the data from the database. So let's just start by creating a method for creating the chart, and this is known from previous example. We just create an X label, Y label, and a title, and then we use this AddScatter and refresh in order to plot the data X and the data Y. And now we need to retrieve that data, X data and the Y data, from this sensor data class. So then I just create a new method. I can call it get data, like this. And this method should be called when we open the application. So then I put it here in the form load, like this. And inside this method, we're going to retrieve the data from the database. So now here in this get data function we have created, we are able to retrieve data from this get sensor data method that we have created in the sensor data class. So here we have the method get sensor data, and this method actually retrieves the necessary data from the database. And then here in our form 1.cs, this data from this method are put into this variable sensor data list. So this is a list, C# list, basically, in order to plot the data using this ScottPlot library. We need to have to convert the data to two different arrays, one array for the X data and one array for the Y data. So basically I've just made some basic code in order to convert from this data type, which is this list of data from the database created here in this method. And then this code makes sure that we are able to convert from that data to two arrays, namely one array for the X data and one array for the Y data. And the X data is just this data ID from the database, which you see here, basically this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So this will be the X values, and then this data value will be the Y values, which you have here. So now we have actually been able to retrieve the data from the database, and now the next step is just to actually plot these data. So then here we just, when we have converted the necessary data here, we just call this create chart method that we have created already here. Like this. So basically that should be it. Of course this one needs this argument. It needs to have this data X as an input argument and data Y as an argument. So basically let's just run this application now and see what's happening. Yeah, there you see. So actually this is the data that are retrieved from the database, and then we use this. So here we retrieve the data from the database, here, and here we convert the data from the database into two arrays, data X and data Y. And then we call the create chart method, which is basically just retrieving this data X and data Y, and then create an X label, Y label, and title, and then actually plots the values using this Add.Scatter method. So basically now we have been able to actually plot data that are stored in the database and then actually present the data inside this ScottPlot chart. Finally, we can just also put the data in this data grid view. So in order to put the data from the database into a data grid view, we only need one line of code. So then we just start by using data grid view 1, which is this one, which has the name data grid view 1. And then in order to, so basically just type dot and then find the data source method, and then equals to sensor data list. So the sensor data list is the values we get from this get sensor data, which is here in the sensor data class. So the return value here is this sensor data list. So basically that's all we need in order to fill data into the data grid view as well. So then let's just run the application. Yeah, and now you see we are getting the data into the ScottPlot chart, and then we also get the same data into this grid view. So then you see the data ID number 1, which is this one. You see we get the data 20. This is the timestamp. For second value here, 2. This is the timestamp, and this is the actual value. So now we are able to present data from the database both in a chart using this ScottPlot library, and then also here in this data grid view. Finally, we can also improve the appearance of this data grid view. So then I just create a separate method called create grid view, where I just specify the name of the headers. So in that way we can use other names than the actual data columns from the database. We can also specify width of the different columns. So then I just use this method here instead. Create grid view, like this. And the input to this function should be this sensor data list, which we have here. So let's just run it now. So this is our final application. And then you see we are retrieving data, and then we can specify other names here. We can also include units like this, because all values in the graphical user interface should show the unit. So now we know that these values are in degrees Celsius. Also here we know that these values inside the chart are in degrees Celsius. We can also adjust the different columns here, so it fills the entire data grid view. So we can just make them a little bit bigger, 260, 200 or something. So now I have adjusted the width for the different columns, so it fills the entire data grid view like this. So basically now we have created a basic application that are retrieving data from the database, both in a plot or a chart and in a data grid view like this. There is one final thing we may want to improve. So here we have now on the x-axis we have 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Assuming we have data for that goes through many days, or many weeks, many years. Typically we may also want to have the actual date time here on the x-axis instead of the just running numbers like 1, 2, 3, etc. So let's see how we can do that. There's since we already retrieving from the database, we know we have used the data ID as the x-axis and we have used data value as the y-axis, but why not use the timestamp that we have from the database here? Use that on the x-axis instead. So then we just go to the form 1.cs. Then instead of the data ID, we want to use .data timestamp instead. And since in the ScottPlot the x and the y-axis needs to be an array of double, we need to convert this to this timestamp to a double using this to OA date. So actually this is a function that is part of C# that are converting a date format to a double value. So that's the one change update we need to do. Just one line of code we need to change. In addition, we need to specify here forms plot 1 plot x axis dot, and you need to specify that we are using actually a datetime format, and then just set this to true like this. So that's all we need to do. We needed to change this one to actually using the data and the timestamp column from the database instead of this data ID. And then we need to convert it to a double using this to_OA date method, which is part of C#. And then we just need to set that the x-axis axis should be of a date time format. Let's just run it now. So as you see, so this is our final application. We are able to plot the data, and on the x-axis we have date time, and then we have the temperature in degrees Celsius on the y-axis, and we are also showing the data here in a grid view. So that's all for now. So good luck with plotting your data in your Windows Forms applications. Thank you and goodbye.